Welcome to today's webinar, which is Motivational Interviewing for Health Professionals. I'm your facilitator today, Nicola Graham, and I'm really delighted to introduce you to our presenter today, who's Jenny Keady. Now, I've had the pleasure of being coached by Jenny, and in the 25 years that Jenny has worked in the health area, I think she's probably come across every obstacle, excuse, obfuscation, dodge that our clients can present us with, particularly obviously when we're working with behaviour change. And Jenny is highly skilled in facilitating conversations that uncover and reveal what's really getting in the way of our clients' behaviour change. And in doing so, identifying how we can most effectively work with them. And of course, this webinar also provides us with an opportunity to pause and reflect regarding our own behaviours and ambivalence, and perhaps also consider ways we might gently move towards healthier choices for ourselves as well. So lots to get out of this particular webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. So we like to start all of our programs with an acknowledgement, and we acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional custodians past and present on whose lands we meet today. And we acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and the relationship of Aboriginal people to country, and respect the cultural authority of the elders in each community. So I've given you a brief introduction to Jenny, but a little bit more information. Jenny's worked for over 25 years in health promotion, fitness training, program development. She's had roles in government, health retreats, training organisations. Her qualifications were in coaching, training, assessment management, NLP, fitness and recreation. So I'm going to swap screens now and just hand over to Jenny to start our webinar today. Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you, Nicola. Welcome to today's talk on motivational interviewing. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to share a little bit of motivational interviewing with you in 1 hour. We really are going to be skimming the surface, but it really is a fascinating topic. And I guess what I really want to focus on today is either building on, or if it's new to you, maybe sharing some new information with you. I want to encourage you all to keep an open mind. It's quite easy as an adult to either think that we know it all, or on the other hand, often for our head to be so full of information that it really can't take in any more. So hopefully you can keep a bit of an open mind to hear what I have to say or share with you. And at the end of the webinar, you can decide what you want to do with it from there. It's not about it having to, it's not a lecture, it's not about a test at the end. And I do acknowledge that some of you have probably already used this modality a little bit as well. So let's make a start with it. And I want to think about it really primarily being about having conversations about change. And I think that is the key message, that underpins everything that we're going to say today. You've got a series of notes, so you've got basically everything that is going to be on the slides. And I do hope that I will not be sort of reading everything from the slides. That's not what it's about. But I wanted you to have those so that you had a reference point, something that you could go back to and look at after. I often find there's nothing worse than getting some slides and then finding them so brief that they mean very little to you after the webinar. But I think to start the process of, it's really going to come down to 3 key parts of the session today. And tied in with that is 3 key words that I want you to think about. One is what? What is motivational interviewing? Let's get clear on what we're talking about to start the process with. The second part is why. Why could this be useful for us to know as health professionals when we're working with clients? And in that section, we'll explore a little bit more about change and ambivalence. And finally, and probably the most important part of the session, is how can motivational interviewing be used when working with our clients? And we'll have a look there at both the processes of MI, I'll call it MI most of the time going forward, and also the skills that we can use. And you'll be surprised, or pleasantly surprised, to know that most of the skills are things that you're probably already doing. And then we'll just wrap that up with a brief summary in terms of some key points to remember and what you can do to get started. But I think that concept of what, why, and how is probably a good little trigger that you can think about going forward. When you're in your day-to-day work, what am I doing, or what is needed for the client at the moment? Why is this important? But importantly, then how can I move forward with it? So motivational interviewing, it's been around for a long time now. It's been around for nearly 40 years, and it was developed in the 1980s by a gentleman called William Miller, and who later partnered with Stephen Rolnick to form it. And I listened to an interview recently, and I thought it was interesting to share their story with you. Both of these two people were working independently. William Miller was actually, he'd studied psychology, and he was working in a treatment centre where they were dealing with addiction. And often people say, yep, MI started off in the addiction field. But I found their individual stories quite fascinating, and they resonated for me, and maybe they will for you. With Miller, when he was in this treatment centre, and he was a relatively new kid on the block, he was sort of given the task one time to sort of work with a group of, I suppose call them inmates for want of a better word at this time. And, I can almost picture this as he was sort of saying it. He's got some more experienced practitioners around him who say, there, you take over that group, because they're a really tough group. Nothing that we do works for them. They're really obnoxious. So you, as a new kid on the block, you get to work with them. And yet what he was surprised at is that when he did work with them and he used the approach that later developed and evolved into motivational interviewing, he had a very different opinion of these people. And when there was discussions going on in the days later, he sort of thought, hang on, what they're saying and describing of these people is not the experience that I had. So I thought that was sort of kind of interesting, because, I certainly can relate to times when as a practitioner in different areas, people have thought about some problem clients, and I'll say that in inverted commas. Then on the other hand, and it was a little bit later on, Stephen Rolnick was working more as a nurse's aide at the time, but interestingly enough, in a similar sort of environment where it was like a treatment centre. And what he did was he found that in those days it was a very confrontational approach. And you can imagine people who were in addiction facilities were seen to be potentially, the bottom rung of the ladder. They were people who, they were sort of blaming these people, were seen as irresponsible, in denial, all this sort of stuff. And he found that, he was concerned at the approach, especially when one of the participants in the group later left the group, went home, shot his wife in front of a child, killed himself, and blah, blah, blah. And as I said, it's not meant to focus on that. But what it did, it triggered in him the need to go, isn't there a better way that we can work with people? Now, I'm certainly not inferring that, anything that we do is directly responsible for leading to that to happen. But it was just interesting that both these men, in their own way, saw that there was better ways to communicate with people. And then, interestingly enough, they got together in Australia. And when they got together in Australia, it was a result of that sort of partnership that has then evolved into what we now know as motivational interviewing. So I thought that was just an interesting little side thing. So in these next two slides, I've really just presented some different ways of describing what it is. As I said, it's up to you to decide which of these resonates for you. Some people describe it as an evidence-based model for increasing motivation and self-efficacy, and that was traditionally what it was seen to be. Because it's been around for almost 40 years, it's had lots of different applications in now a range of fields, certainly not just the addiction area. And so there's thousands of reports and research projects that have been done around it to sort of prove the efficacy of it. In a simpler way, it is really about that it was developed, I suppose, initially to improve conversation about behaviour change. Change is one of those things we often think is quite simple, and this was developed as a way to help the conversation about change. It encourages what they call change talk, and we'll talk about that more later on, where change talk is really anywhere where the client is talking about the possibility of change. And it helps resolve, or the idea is to resolve that ambivalence or what they used to describe it as resistance, and we'll look at that. But in terms of some more formal definitions, there's three here. The middle one is what they describe as a layperson definition. The practitioner one is at the bottom, and this other one at the top is a mixture of all of them. So I think the key word to think about here is it's client-centered method for motivating change. And we do that by exploring and resolving ambivalence. So some key words that you will see come through the whole presentation: client-centered, motivating change, resolving ambivalence, and the key is to sort of strengthen the person's own motivation from within. So I'll let you decide which of those works for you. If you're exploring or talking to people about this, I think it's always important to describe it in a language that works for you. So when we look at what motivational interviewing is really all about, as I said, it's about increasing the motivation, but we can only do that by helping the person boost their self-efficacy, their belief that they can actually make that change. And we do that by sort of tapping into the client and looking to help them find their own meaningful reasons to change. You know, it's something that is done with someone, not on them or not to them. And I think the good news is, for all of us, probably with a mix of different tools in our kit, it is a tool that can be integrated with a number of other principles. So it's not something that is unique and always has to stand alone. It can be blended with other things that you do. I think the key is it doesn't impose change on someone. And I think what I'll encourage you to do as we go through this, in addition to having the open mind, just be aware of if I say things that maybe push buttons on you or not. I'm not intending to sort of, to create havoc, but because it is something that is a little bit different, possibly there might be sometimes you go, oh, I'm not sure about that. So just flag those for your own reflection as well. And some of these points may be a little bit different to what you've been used to. The other part of it is that it can be used in a variety of different settings. As I said, it started out in the addiction field. It's heavily used in education, also in healthcare, corrections, even for people from a personal point of view. So as Nicola said at the beginning, you can think about this from your own personal perspective and making change, or you can think about it in terms of working with your clients as well. And I'll use the word clients, knowing that for some people they may refer to patients, but for the general idea here, we'll say clients, and then you can interpret that how you need. But the key is we're looking for those motivational processes that come from within the individual. But I think the key that makes this important, and it's really important to understand this at the beginning, is MI is not just a set of technical sort of tools or interventions. It's a particular spirit that underlies motivational interviewing that is really important. And this is what everything else is built on from here. So this diagram here shows you that there is sort of 4 key components, all of which interact, all of which contribute to what they describe as the spirit of MI. And in Rolnick and Miller's sort of most recent book, which is still probably about 7 years old now, this spirit concept has really sort of been a big change, because they actually described it, and I thought this also resonated. It was like after doing training in this area for so long, they felt like they were teaching people the words rather than the songs or the music that went with the words. So they described the spirit as a way of incorporating not just the words but the music. So I thought that was kind of a nice way of thinking about it as well. Now I've added these little words beside just as a little trigger and as a reminder for you. But when we talk about collaboration, we're talking about collaborating with the client, with the patient, with the other person. It's very much about a partnership. It's about working alongside somebody where your expertise becomes like a tool in your kit that is probably behind you, is my way of describing it. It's the sort of thing, nobody takes your expertise away from you, but in this context, what you're doing, you're working alongside the client in a partnership. Now, it doesn't mean to say you have to agree with everything that they say or do, but hopefully you get that idea that it's partnering rather than confronting, which can sometimes be the alternative or what people have been used to. So the with is just a little bit of a reminder. So acceptance and acceptance of the client, and I often describe this as meeting the client where they're at, and you do that in a sort of non-judgmental way. So acceptance will also facilitate change, and it's a really key starting point in terms of change. It's a starting point for us as individuals, but it's also especially important for the people that we're working with. Quite often a client will feel, not good enough or inferior because you're the expert and there they are, and look at the situation they have found themselves in. So that acceptance is a key part of the mix here. The evocation.
Jenny, excuse me interrupting. A couple of people are having some intermittent sound, only a few, and we've got a lot of people online. So I might just get you to turn your webcam off, just for people who might be having bandwidth issues, and that just might help their sound. Thanks, Jenny.
Okay. Is that better?
That's
Does
great.
that sound?
Yep, beautiful.
Okay,
Thanks,
perfect.
Jenny. All good.
Very good. Okay, I certainly want you to be able to hear it. So evocation is really just drawing out from the person what is important to them. What are the motivations? It's sort of trying to tap into values. What's important for that client? It's working on the basis that, we all have the answers within us, and it's about, giving the client the benefit of that and the space to draw that information out from them. Because we know that lasting change is more likely to occur when the client really has their own reasons or determination for change. And then the final part of that box there is compassion, and it's compassion for. It's about really being interested in understanding what things are like from the client's perspective. It's not about crossing the line and being sympathetic and overstepping that mark, but it's having a genuine sort of, I suppose, interest in what's going on for the client at the time. So all of these areas interrelate, and together they actually form the spirit of MI. So that's the end of this first section, and I just want you to just take a moment, if you can, and just maybe write one or two words or highlight them or scribble in your notes as to what key things stood out for you. Because we will come back and look at the how, but I want to sort of just step to the side for a moment and really look more into the change aspect, because also if it wasn't for the change and the complexity of change, we may not need to use MI. But just take a quick moment to maybe capture one or two words or concepts that were either new or that resonated for you, and we can build on those later on. Okay, so moving into part two, is really the why part of it, and why could motivational interviewing be helpful for us as health professionals? And I think probably the simplest answer to that is that most of us, regardless of what our title is, that we are working in the area of change. And often that is around behaviour change. And I have a few sort of little quirky comments that I use quite regularly, and this is one of them. If change was easy, the client would already be doing it. And I think sometimes just reminding ourselves of that is also important. But in saying that, change can be complex. And this next little section, which is really about change 101, sort of on steroids, is really going to highlight that. It's not designed to be the answers to change, but it's just designed to sort of remind us why it can be complex, and why it can be complex for us when we have the information, the qualifications, the experience behind us, and therefore imagine what it can be like for our clients as well. But no, behaviour change can be hard, and especially when it involves habits. Some of these habits that people have got have been developed over a lifetime or over many, many years. And bearing that in mind, that it's not simple as saying just make a change. And know that lasting behaviour change, if we're serious, does take some time and effort. So whenever you start to talk about change, we're always going to hear the things that are getting in the way. Some people like to call them excuses, but others it's barriers and obstacles. And I think the key with this is to know that it's inevitable, it will happen. But even though they sound familiar, it's really important that we keep an open mind and explore what this means for the client. You know, like you hear things like lack of time or lack of motivation, and you in your own mind might think, oh, I know what that is, but do you really know what it is for the client that you're working with at the time? So in this slide, I've just listed a lot of things that often come up as reasons why people can't make changes. What I'm describing them as common barriers. So you'll see there, lack of, fear of are quite common themes. I think the other thing to think about too is that barriers come in different forms. So some barriers will be more behavioural. It'll be what somebody is doing. You know, they might be more situational, might be the particular situation that somebody is in. You know, there's some people who have found that with the COVID lockdown that they're eating more. So that might be the situation that's, you know, forced them into a behaviour that's not supportive of what they're trying to achieve. Others might be more cognitive. It might be the way somebody's thinking about something. And maybe they're thinking that they've tried this before and it hasn't worked, or it's all too hard. And yet there might be other things that are more emotional. So, you know, when people are emotional or feeling more emotional, sometimes their behaviour is not as rational as it could be at other times. So just sort of highlighting here that sort of barriers, it's one thing to say it's an excuse, but that it is a lot more complicated than that. And really being, you know, clear that you don't have the answers. Don't assume you know what that means for somebody. The barriers is one thing that gets in the way. You know, readiness to change is another big area. And again, this is just a very, you know, 2-minute sort of comment on it. But how do we know if somebody is really ready to make a change? Now, we often assume because, you know, they've asked for help or they've come to one of our programs that they are ready to change. But are they? You know, we often use the analogy is, you know, when somebody joins a gym and signs up and pays their membership fee, what do we know that they're ready for? You know, in reality, we know that they're ready to pay over their money. We don't know for sure that they are ready to actually start exercising. So it sounds silly, but it is something just to be aware of. Now, some of you may be familiar with Prochaska and De Clemente and the trans-theoretical model of change. And you know, I'm not going to go through it in a lot of detail. I'll just show you a slide in a second that just highlights that through their research, they've identified that people go through a process. There's different stages of change. But I think what's really important to recognise with this is that people can be at different stages of change for different parts of their wellness or different behaviours. So the key to be able to support a client is really knowing where they're at and where they're ready to make a change. So this particular slide really just highlights the different stages. Pre-contemplation, where somebody's not even thinking of making a change, you know, through to contemplation, preparation. You can read that in your own time. But you'll see also around this particular diagram, there's a few little tips there about how to work with those different stages of change, because people don't come in to you and say, well, excuse me, Nicola, I'm in the pre-contemplation stage of change. What do you think I can do? You know, it's not language that the clients use. So to me, this is about you understanding this as a concept and then knowing, you know, just sort of, I suppose, fine-tuning your senses so that when somebody comes in, you start to think about where they're at. You know, if they're in pre-contemplation, they might be saying, I won't, for example. You know, contemplation might be saying more about, you know, I may or I can't. Sorry, they might be saying that they're aware there's a problem, but they're not really ready to take action. And quite often it means that they're focused on all the reasons not to. But as I said, that becomes quite complex. It is some really interesting reading, and they have a book referred to as Changing for Good. So if you did want to read more on that, I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at that book. But I think that the key is, and we'll share with you later on, that there are some rulers that we look at, some scaled rulers which can also help you in terms of knowing where somebody is at in terms of readiness to change. The key takeaway from this, though, is to understand that if you think somebody is up here at the preparation and they're ready to take action, but really they're not, they're still back here at the pre-contemplation stage, your approach can actually hinder their change. So when you understand the different stages of change and understand where they're at so that you can target those areas that they're most ready to change, it will make your job so much easier. Now, I think the key message that I got from this when I first, came across it many years ago was that, because I was working around, fitness and wellness, and we assume that somebody wants to get fit, well, that means they're ready to change exercise and ready to change their diet and maybe manage their stress. But, some people may not be ready to change their diet, even though they might be ready to exercise. So the key is finding where they're most ready to make a change and starting off with that, because often there will be a bit of a trickle-down effect. Now this slide, and I just want to assure you all that the cow was not hurt in the filming of this, but this area is really important, and it's that whole thing of ambivalence. It's a word that we see a lot in the area of change. And I think what it's important to understand is that ambivalence is normal. It's not pathology, it's not a condition. It's very normal for people, when they're wanting to make a change, to have some views on why they want to make a change, and also have some views on why staying the same is okay as well. And often what happens is the individual has both those thoughts going on in their head at the same time. So it can feel quite overwhelming. It can feel like they're literally stuck on the fence, which is the reason I shared this slide with you. It's a normal part of it's a normal human experience of change, and any of us on the line, I'm sure we've felt this or might be feeling this now as well. So important to accept that as well. But thinking about, why are people ambivalent? And there's many different reasons that they are. For some, they can't imagine themselves behaving any differently. This might be what they've been used to. This is how they've been used to living, working, for a long, long time. There might be some examples where people don't really know how to change. In an era when we are overloaded with information, you think if it was just as simple as reading a book or Googling something, we would have all the answers. But there are still some people who don't know how to change. Maybe they're still weighing up the benefits. Maybe they can still see that there is more value in staying the same. So sometimes, accepting that and helping that person explore those things can be really useful. But a big one often is that they have a lack of confidence. They may have tried several things in the past and it hasn't worked. So that fear of failure, leading to, lacking of confidence can be a huge barrier. But it also, another way of thinking about this, it's like there's this ping pong ball that's going back and forth in the client's head. So it can actually start to feel really uncomfortable, because on one hand they do want to change, and they know they have to change. On the other hand, oh, it's hard. What will other people say? What if it doesn't work? And that can actually feel really uncomfortable and can really be draining of energy. And something I found out recently, which just added to this, is that the cognitive state that puts us in also makes us very less likely to be receptive to well-meaning advice or hints or suggestions and stuff like that. So even though the client might be feeling ambivalent, traditionally what happens is the well-meaning practitioner says, we'll fix you, we'll give you the answers, but the client isn't even in a space to be receptive to receiving that. So it's almost like, unless we can actually meet the client where they're at and acknowledge that ambivalence is okay, and sort of almost mark time with them for a little while, the chances of moving them forward are going to be much slimmer. So one more slide on ambivalence that I think is useful to know is that, I feel ambivalence really is an opportunity. It is a bit like the arrow or the direction that you can see here, like the fork in the road. There's many reasons why the client is ambivalent, and it's important to acknowledge those and know that it's normal. But if you want to look at it from the positive side of things, the fact that the client is at least considering change, is a step in the right direction. They're not digging their heels in saying, I won't. There is the potential there if we handle it the right way. So think about it as being like that fork in the road. Not only do we have to meet the client where they're at, But just know that the approach that we take with the client can make a difference on whether they go down the I won't do this to, well, I may and I could give it a try. And I think that we underestimate the effect that we can have as the practitioner in influencing this. So know that there's many reasons why the client is stuck, and that's their story. But just also know that in your role as the health professional, you know, you can influence that as well. It's not about manipulation, but it's also about recognising. And I often talk about this as being a more facilitative approach, rather than, we don't get into the client's story. We don't need to. We need to recognise that the client is stuck, but we don't want them to take up residence in that space of being stuck. There's another way of thinking about it. So your approach, if you push too hard, you're going to create more resistance. It's about how you move forward with that, which we'll explore shortly. The word resistance is something that traditionally has been used around change and about people, you know, not wanting to change. And in the more recent work of Rolnick and Miller, they don't use the word resistance at all, or they use it in a different context. And how they describe it is that often resistance is a reaction to what's been going on as opposed to the change part itself. So they're suggesting that people do not resist change, but they resist being changed. So, you know, think about being, you know, what environment we've all been brought up in. You know, traditional healthcare, education system have often been very top-down, very directive in their approach, and the client usually took a very passive role in that. Whereas if we're serious about behaviour change, we need clients taking a more active role in this process. So think about the fact that, you know, if we have assessed somebody, or in our own mind, it doesn't need to be a formal assessment, we've thought somebody is more ready to change than they are, and we're pushing forward as if they're ready to go, and they're not, they're also likely to put the brakes on. And for some people, it can simply just be that fear of failure. It's those little steps that, you know, they're seeing it as a big thing, and whereas the little steps can often make a big difference as well. But also just know that there is a thing called the psychological reactance. And this was some study and some work that was done way back in the 60s. And it's a normal response for us to resist or to push against change. You know, so often the more we try and persuade or push someone to try something, the more that sort of leads to people digging their heels in. And unfortunately, what can often happen is the opposite. Not only do they do their heels in, they actually do something even worse, or they totally don't do anything at all. And that's what this little picture here is trying to sort of show you. There is also a concept that they call the righting reflex. And this is something we have to be really, really careful of as health professionals, because quite often we're people who want to help, we want to make a difference. We've got a lot of knowledge, and we want to share that with people. And sometimes that desire to sort of fix or to help somebody can lead us to sort of perhaps be a little bit too over-enthusiastic with what we do. You have to also remember that that traditional healthcare model also came from a deficit model perspective. It came from something is wrong, something is broken, so therefore I need to fix it and get people on the right track. So know that, and again, just be aware of this when you are working with clients. Are you really meeting them where they're at, or is there part of you that its righting reflex is wanting to sort of step up and, you know, and take the lead? Traditionally, that sort of righting reflex has been a lot more directive, which is what creates the resistance. And remember, it comes from a good intent. You know, the heart is in the right place. It's the approach that perhaps is not as effective as it could be. And if you really want to see some of that in action, you could go onto YouTube, and there's the National Heart Foundation have got a series of video clips, and there is a well-meaning practitioner showing you the righting reflex in action. And it's really easy to think, oh, I would never do that. But sometimes it's our motivation, our passion, our background that all comes together and can create more resistance for the client. So the other thing to think about in terms of change, and as I said, this is lots of little tidbits of information, so not trying to sort of take it all in per se, but just help us appreciate that change is complex. So it's okay if it does feel a bit tricky to start with. So 2 types of motivation, and knowing that, you know, it's often the word, I'm not motivated, or I don't have the motivation. And know that that motivation often does provide energy. So it gets you started. It keeps you going when you'd rather be doing something else. But not all motivation is created equally. So some motivation, the controlled motivation, is stuff that's coming from the outside in. You know, it's coming from somebody else saying you should or you have to. And usually there's some kind of judgment implied. Or on the other hand, if the client is saying, oh, well, I suppose I should do this, often that might be coming from the place of trying to please somebody else. Now, this can lead to compliance, but it tends to be very short term in nature. Often what it will lead to is more defiance, because, you know, force and fear doesn't really create behaviour change. And this little cartoon, hopefully you can see that there is, you know, again, I'm sort of not trying to criticize the traditional model, but it is something most of us can relate to. You know, you'd go to see the doctor and they'd tell you, you know, stop this, stop this. It was all quite negative. And often what happened as a result of that, you just tuned out, or you didn't do what they said, or you took the script and it stayed in your bag. So it is the way a lot of people have been used to working. And I think the other thing that I thought about when putting this together is, bear in mind that some of your clients, by the time they get to you, may have, you know, been at the receiving end of this approach. So all the more reason to be able to sort of stop and meet them where they're at now. Ideally, what we want to do is focus more on this autonomous motivation, and that's that motivation that comes from within. It's where there's a choice and an interest. We want to actually do it, and we feel that we have a little bit more control, and most of us like that. So when we feel that we're in control and driving the bus, so to speak, we're more likely to take the action, we're more likely to enjoy it, and it will increase our energy and stuff. So wouldn't it be nice to think that this would be the approach that we saw more often in the healthcare environment? And this little quote is, you know, not some new age fad. You can see that, you know, people are generally better persuaded by the reasons which they themselves have discovered than by those which have come into the mind of others. And that was a quote that came out of the 17th century, and it's probably just as relevant for here. So that is the end of the section 2. So again, can I just get you to maybe flag 2 or 3 things on your notes, sort of what sort of stood out, something that you might want to look back at, or something that, you know, resonated for you. Remembering that it's just going, wow, actually you feel exhausted. Change is complex, and recognizing that is important. So let's move into part 3, which is really the how side of things. How can motivational interviewing help? We talked at the beginning about broadly what it was and the spirit of it, and I think understanding that spirit is important. But we can talk about it and understand the theory of it, but it doesn't really mean a great deal unless we know how to apply it. So there's 2 ways of applying this and looking at it. What we're going to look at is the formal processes of MI, and we're going to look at the skills. So the formal processes, and these are process. I think that's the thing to remember, that change is not an event, it is a process. And so with MI, what they're suggesting in their more recent work is that there's 4 steps involved in the process. And we're going to look at each one of those and what they mean. So while they look linear, and they are initially, know that they also, you sort of dance with them, you know, as well. So we'll explore that as we move through each of them. So the engaging process, that's the one that we start with, and it's really very much about laying the foundations for the relationship. You know, the client needs to feel that they can trust you. They need to feel that they can have a say in this. This is where they need to feel that there is that sort of partnership. I see the engaging process, often the start of the conversation, as being an investment in the rest of the session. It's if we don't do this well, then when we move into some of those more complicated areas, like when they have or haven't done what they said they were going to do, that it's going to make it so much harder. So see this area as really important. And in some schools, I thought they even suggest you could spend 20% of your time engaging. Now, we won't go through each one, but what I've added, and this is something that you can just look at in your own time, is how do you know if you're doing this, And these are some questions that you can self-reflect on. You don't need to sit there and do it every time you talk to somebody, but these questions will allow you to think, am I engaging effectively with the client? And I've done that for each of the different processes, but that's just a little bit extra for those who want to. Now, the next step in the process is about focusing. And this is sort of where, once we've got that connection and that relationship built, we have to then agree on what we're talking about, because we're not trying to talk about absolutely everything in this area. We might be identifying the areas where somebody's stuck, but agreeing so that we're both on the same page in terms of what we're going to be talking about. Getting permission from them to discuss or explore certain areas, I think, is the key here. And usually the focus would be around the area that they want to make a change on. So the decisional balance is a tool that we'll talk about shortly, and that is something that can be useful at this point in time. But the whole idea is really just being clear so that you're talking about the same thing as they are, and that you've agreed on what that looks like for both of you today. Again, there's a few questions, because sometimes you might think you know what you're talking about, and you're coming in and going on sort of one tangent, and the client's going on off on another tangent, and then you get to the end of the session and go, hang on, well, why didn't we make any progress on this? And as I said, I like this concept. You want to feel like you're dancing with them as opposed to wrestling with the client. Now, this third stage is the evoking stage. And again, this is where we're talking about this as being like the preparation for change, like we've engaged effectively and we've decided on what we're talking about. Now we're really starting to dig a little bit deeper, and we're trying to draw out from the client what their own values are, what's important to them about the change, why would they want to make this particular change. It's like we know that if people feel a sense of meaning about what they're doing, they're more likely to sort of want to make those changes. So this evoking, drawing out of the client what's important for them. And again, there's some questions for you to self-reflect on. And a couple of things in particular at this stage, when you're listening and drawing that information out, really sort of fine-tune that hearing so that you can hear, am I hearing any change talk? Is there any talk where I'm hearing about the possibility of change? And be mindful as to whether you're sort of pushing further in one direction than you need to be at that stage. Or even worse, potentially, is that writing reflex of yours being activated so that you're the one arguing for change. We really want any argument for change to be coming from the client. So important. And then the final stage of the process is the planning, and this is the bridge to change. So once we've actually, identified that there is something the person wants to change, then the key is to still take it slowly. We don't suddenly get to that stage and go, beauty, and we then undo all the good work that we've done. So the planning is really about, well, what's one thing that you could do going forward? What's a small step that you could take? And sometimes setting those up as experiments is a good way of doing it. Tiny steps that they can do on a regular basis, looking at what they're doing now and what's one thing that they could do differently. Being aware about obstacles that could get in the way, and it's almost like planning ahead for those. But just keep it simple, don't overcomplicate it. And again, there's some questions. How do you know if you're doing that area well? Are you encouraging their ideas, or are you prescribing a plan? Remembering if we're encouraging ideas, they're more likely to be acted on. And, at times this is where your expertise might sort of stick in. And I think it's important that, you know, we're not saying you can't use your expertise, but to me, the skill in your expertise is in the way that you use it. So, you know, if something's coming up and the client is wanting specific information from you, you might say, well, there's a number of different ways you could do this. You could do it this way, this way, or this way. Which one of those would work for you? And that way the client still feels that they're involved in the decision-making process. It's using your expertise, but it's doing it in a respectful way as well. So the next part of this is really just moving into the skills. And as you'll see, they're skills that are probably quite familiar to you. They're often skills that are identified as core counselling skills. And I think the key with all of these is they sound simple. Think OARS, O-A-R-S, as a bit of a summary of them. But sometimes they sound easier than they actually are. I've been involved in coaching for 20 years, and I often hear people, oh yeah, I know how to ask questions, or I know how to listen. And yet when they go to do it, it's not quite as easy as it sounds. Active listening really does underpin all of these skills, and we don't really ever get taught how to listen. So be mindful that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's the sort of percentage you should be listening versus talking with. And just be aware of whether you're really listening in the moment, or are you just listening sort of really ready to respond. And sometimes people are almost saying to themselves, quick, hurry up, I've got something better that I want to say. So open questions, you know, we all know about open questions, but I think take it a step further. You know, they invite clients to think before they respond. And there's a bit more flexibility in how they choose to answer. So yes, we know that an open question requires more than a yes or a no answer, but it also should require something that you don't necessarily have the answer to, because what you really want to do is see what that means for the client. And you have to just trust that you don't know where the client's going to go with it, but that's okay as well. And the key to that is for you to be genuinely interested and curious in what they might say. So questions starting with a what or a how are usually the most powerful when it comes to open questions. I've just put here some sample questions that you might like to consider. There's no such thing as a perfect question. It will depend on the context, but also really important that you think about the wording that resonates for you and the person that you're working with. So you've got 2 slides of questions there, just showing you how that what and that how can come into be. Another one that I saw recently that I thought was quite good too, and it might be relevant for some of you, and it said something like, you know, so the test result is X, for example. So what do you make of this? So again, getting the feedback rather than it be a judgment, getting some feedback from the client so that they get to reflect on it. You know, so how do you see the connection between X and Y? Again, it's a good way to try and let a client see the difference between or the relationship between what they're doing and maybe some of the outcomes or the results they're getting. So imagine if X was the test result and Y was what has been happening for them in the last week or so. You know, and that could be around their behaviours or their situations or emotions or cognitions. But, you know, getting the client to reflect and see the link between their behaviour and the results that they may be getting. So the A out of OARS stands for affirmations, and it's really about acknowledging the strengths and what is good from within the client. It's not just about saying good work, it's about saying and acknowledging what the client has done. And this is a good way of helping support their own confidence in their own ability. So it's a little bit like, so it was really great that you were able to, you know, do that cooking class and add some variety to your repertoire. So focusing on the behaviour or the action that they took. And obviously it needs to be genuine. That sort of should be pretty self-explanatory. It's just that people are more likely to trust or listen to people who recognise and affirm their strengths. And yet quite often we don't know how to affirm those strengths within ourselves. So you could actually ask the client, so tell me, you know, what do you think you're good at? Or another way, and an even better way, I think, is to say, so, you know, if I was to ask your best friend or your partner, what would they say are your strengths? And so getting people aware of what they can do, their inner strengths and qualities. Reflections is probably one of the most powerful tools that you can use when it comes to skills. And reflections, we probably need to do more reflections and even questions. A reflection is simply mirroring back to the client what you've heard them say. It's not about having to capture everything. It's capturing the essence of what they said. But if it's in similar words to what the client has said, you'll find that they are more likely to sort of hear it. Whereas if it's different, they'll start going, hang on, is that what I really said? So, it's like this quote down the bottom, which I think is very powerful and sums it up. When I hear myself speak, I learn what I believe. So, every now and again, often maybe 2 reflections to every question. And this is what I sometimes see. It's something that people are not as familiar with. So, I'd encourage you to sort of look at reflections. It slows the pace down. The client feels heard. It extends the conversation, but it also taps into something deeper and may often bring up emotions or needs that actually lie beneath the surface. And then the S in the ORS was really about summaries, and really that is just a reflection that pulls together several things. Now that might be after a little bit of conversation, you might say something else. So let me just see if I've got that right. And that way it might be a more interim summary. Alternatively, at the end of a conversation, you might say, so let's just recap on what we've worked through today, and you would do a more detailed summary of the whole thing. Again, not every word, but knowing that you've got the overall essence of the conversation. It just ensures you're both on the same page. So this last little bit is about the tools, and I referred to the rulers when we talked about readiness to change. And as I said, readiness to change and the stages of change is a very powerful document or powerful concept to be familiar with, but it's not language that a client would use. Whereas it's really simple to come back to things like the rulers. And this is sort of where, if you think about readiness, really comes down to the sort of combination of importance and confidence. So this, when we focus on importance, and we need to do that first, because if something isn't important to the client, it really doesn't matter how confident they are. So we would say something like, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how important is it that you do this, whatever change you're talking about at this time? And let the client identify a number. And similar, we would repeat that with the confidence. But as I said, start off with importance and then move on to confidence. In coaching, we talk about 7 being the magic number. Some people would say there's no such thing as a magic number. But, if you're looking at confidence, you could also add, so what would you need to do to make that go to the next higher number? Or you could actually say, so tell me why it's at 7 and not a 2. You'd have to go to a lower number than when you use that second question, because that way the client will start talking up the reasons why they do have some confidence. So this last little part with the tools will become quite quick, but you have got this information in your slides. So the decisional balance is a great tool when you're exploring ambivalence, and that means that there is a behaviour that the person is currently doing and there's another one that they would like to be doing instead. It is an extended version of a pros and cons, but to me it's not as mechanical as a pros and cons, especially when it's done in the way this particular diagram is. We start off looking at what they like about what they're currently doing. It's easy, the client talks about it quite freely. Okay, but what are your concerns about staying the same? Or what if nothing changes? Then we move over to the bottom right and we go, so what are your concerns about change? And then finish up with your reasons to change. So there's a process behind it. When we do this, the client's comfortable talking about what's currently going on, but that is also giving you clues to potential barriers to change. When they talk about their concerns about staying the same, that actually encourages some change talk, where they start talking about the possibility of change. Then we start really looking more at the new behaviour, and so what are their concerns? So sometimes this is where the fear, or what will people think, or what if I fail, and that comes up again, and you can see that's more potential barriers to change. And then finishing on a positive note where the client is talking about the benefits of change can be really helpful. So that's a particular process. That's the order that we do it in coaching, and I think I really like that. I am a bit biased. I've actually given you an example of to smoke or not smoke so you can see it in action. You can talk it, you can get clients to write things down. How you use it is up to you. But obviously what often comes out is that you can see that there is a conflict of values, which is what is leading the person to feel stuck. So know that it's not about having a final decision made, but it's helping the client unpack what is going on for them. Then when you get to action, and again, I will just keep this really simple by saying that health and wellness is often about behaviours. It's about what we do on a regular basis. And so having a behavioural goal, which is an ongoing behaviour rather than a one-off outcome, is often more effective. And the smaller the steps, the better. There's a great book called Atomic Habits by James Clear, and that also sort of really talks to you about, you know, the small steps that you need to take. And they're so small that anybody can do, sort of thing, but anybody has to be right for the client. So key points to remember on MI, and we're almost done on time. So the spirit of MI is really what everything else is based on, and see it as a mindset as well as a heart set. That underlies everything that MI is about. It's also a particular kind of conversation about change. It's very much client-centered as well, and it requires you to be actively listening and meeting the client where they're at. So how to use it going forward, there's a number of different ways, some of which you were probably already doing and doing very well. I have no doubt about that. But I think the key is to, you know, through the different sections, identify some things that perhaps are new to you or something that you want to test yourself with. And like any skill, it might feel a little bit awkward initially, but be kind to yourself. You know, think about being more mindful, asking open questions. You know, where is the client at with their readiness to change? Experiment with the reflections and possibly the importance and confidence rulers. You know, look for some strengths, shine the light on what is working for the client, and keep shining that. Often the client is shining the light on what is not working. So you as the practitioner have that ability to shine the light on what you can see working. Encourage those small steps and be aware of that writing reflex. But, you know, be kind, as I said, be open to learning, learn from the experience and keep going, and I'm sure you will see the benefit of it. The third edition of their book is Motivational Interviewing, and there's lots of good information in that as well. So there we go, almost on time. So thank you. I hope that it was a lot of information. I am aware of that, but please know you have got those slides that you can refer back to with a bit extra content to support your learning. So thank
Jenny,
you,
thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. So much fantastic information there, Jenny. I have got a question from Liz that I'd just like to put to you quickly. Liz is asking, with a decisional tool, do you put it into a table and present it to the client in hard copy as part of the strategy, or what's the best way of using that?
You can do either. I think the main thing is that to start the process by having a conversation, it is really useful to have it as a template, and you might sort of start talking about it. You might give the template to the client and say, keep thinking about it over the course of the week. It gives a bit of homework, because often the client will keep thinking of things after the session has finished. Alternatively, you could just ask even one or two of those questions. So what do you like about what you're currently doing? What concerns you? Because what it's doing, it's developing discrepancy. And when the client feels that discrepancy, it helps them get clarity about change.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jenny. I think one of the things I'll go away with is very much that sense of dancing with clients rather than wrestling.
Yeah, and I think that was the final step, wasn't it? Like I did it for the first two, but what I'd like everybody to think about, you know, think of one or two things that you've either learned or relearned, and what's one thing that you can do going forward to make meaning of this. You've invested an hour, you've got a lot of information, and good luck in applying it.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And
Pleasure.
also, I think as well, there's, as you say, many areas that we can apply this to.
Totally.
And one of the areas I know that I will try and be a bit more succinct and nuanced in is I'll experiment using MI with my teenage daughter. I'm hoping
Yes,
that that will help.
exactly,
So just
as well as
very
our own lifestyle habits.
indeed, yeah, very much about turning the focus on ourselves as well. So just very briefly, just want to finish off with some housekeeping, and just a reminder that there are a whole range of services that we offer both for health professionals and for clients at MS, from education to employment support to peer support to NDIS, etc. There is some online symptom management education tools, and you can find them at the web address here. We are a registered NDIS provider with different services provided in different areas, and the gateway to all of our services is through MS Connect and the numbers there. You are eligible for free ebooks. That's the information you need to be able to access the ebooks. And we do have webinar recordings, and I will send a recording of this session to everybody. There's a lot of information in here. Jenny has many years of experience, and you can tell that with all the depth of information she gave us today. So I will make sure a recording is sent to you all after this session. And you can also purchase recordings of other health professional webinars we have delivered. Inform is the newsletter that helps keep you informed about up and coming education, and you can subscribe to that through our website or again through MS Connect. So that's our MS Connect number and email address, and there is a short, very brief survey, I promise you, after this webinar. It'd be fantastic if you could complete that. Thank you very much, everybody, for your time today. Thank you again. Really appreciate your time.